It was a clear afternoon over the English Channel, 1943. The whine of Rolls-Royce engines filled the air as British Spitfires cut through the clouds, chasing the silhouette of a German bomber formation. The tension was palpable, a deadly game of cat and mouse at 20,000 feet. Below, the calm of the countryside seemed impossibly distant from the chaos in the sky. But in the midst of this deadly ballet, something peculiar was happening. In a field not far from the airbase, a convoy of trucks pulled up, unloading crates of something unexpected: ice cream. No, it wasn't for the ground crews or the officers. It was for the pilots who would soon be taking to the skies again, risking their lives in another deadly dogfight. To those on the German side, this was almost unbelievable. How could a nation at war afford such a frivolous luxury in the middle of such carnage? As the first spoonful of ice cream was served to the pilots, a bewildering thought crossed the mind of a German pilot who had once fought against these very men. How could they be so carefree in the face of battle? It was an image that would stay with him long after the war ended. A strange and startling reminder of the psychological gulf that separated the Axis and Allied experiences of war. World War II was not just a conflict of nations. It was a war of extremes. A war where soldiers and airmen were pushed to the edge of human endurance, their bodies and minds tested in ways that seemed unimaginable. For the pilots involved, the air was their battleground and the sky was both their refuge and their grave. The physical and mental toll on these men was immense, especially in the early years of the war, when flying conditions were brutal and the stakes couldn't have been higher. For the German Luftwaffe, the early days of the war had been marked by triumph. In the Blitzkrieg offensives, their pilots soared through the skies over Europe with ruthless precision. But as the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe found itself locked in an increasingly desperate struggle. The Allied air forces, particularly the British Royal Air Force (RAF) and the American 8th Air Force, mounted a fierce resistance. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was caught in a brutal attrition battle, struggling to defend occupied Europe from relentless bombing raids. German pilots, though highly skilled, often flew under the weight of near-constant combat and limited resources. Many were young, having been thrust into the war with little experience, and their life expectancy was grim. The demands of continuous air patrols, long hours, and the ever-present threat of enemy aircraft or anti-aircraft fire created an atmosphere of relentless pressure. The notion of respite or even simple comfort was a foreign concept for the men of the Luftwaffe. They were trained for war, fierce, unyielding, and unforgiving. In contrast, the Allied pilots, particularly those of the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, were also subjected to the harsh realities of aerial combat, but they were afforded certain luxuries that their German counterparts could scarcely imagine. While the rigors of long flights, dangerous bombing runs, and high casualty rates still weighed heavily on them, the Allies found ways to bolster the morale of their air crews in ways that extended beyond the strategic. This was especially true for the American 8th Air Force, which was tasked with the relentless daylight bombing raids over Germany and occupied Europe. The concept of pilot welfare and morale was a priority for the Allies. Airmen were often faced with missions that stretched beyond 12 hours, battling fatigue, extreme conditions, and the psychological toll of seeing their comrades fall from the sky. The Allies understood that in order to keep their pilots sharp, engaged, and willing to fight another day, they needed to ensure they were well rested, motivated, and taken care of. Among the many ways this was achieved, the practice of providing small comforts, luxuries, even, became a significant part of their operations. One of the most surprising morale-boosting efforts involved the distribution of ice cream. It wasn't just a rare treat, it was a carefully planned operation. The American military would arrange for trucks carrying ice cream to be sent to the air bases, sometimes under the guise of regular food shipments, so that pilots could enjoy the unexpected luxury before or after their missions. This wasn't about indulgence in a traditional sense, but about lifting the spirits of men who were about to risk their lives for their country. This practice was so far removed from the experience of the German pilots that it was almost inconceivable to them. They were enduring long, grueling missions, with limited rations and ever-decreasing chances of survival. The idea that Allied pilots could be provided with such a decadent treat in the midst of their duties, a simple yet powerful gesture, was a sharp reminder of the disparity between the two sides' wartime experiences. The notion of ice cream being served in a combat environment seemed almost out of place. But it wasn't just about the ice cream itself. It was part of a larger effort by the Allies to maintain their pilots' morale in a war where they had few other comforts. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lacked similar morale-boosting measures. Though their pilots were brave and highly skilled, they were often left to endure the horrors of war without the luxuries that might have made the endless combat more bearable. The ice cream, served in the middle of battle, represented a profound cultural difference between the nations at war, and it highlighted the stark contrast in the way each side treated its flyers during the conflict. While the German pilots struggled under the weight of attrition, the Allied forces, particularly the United States, were beginning to see the benefits of a morale-centric approach to warfare. The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF in particular, had been faced with a grueling challenge: to conduct daylight bombing missions over heavily defended Axis territory. The losses were staggering, with bombers falling from the sky at a horrific rate. Between 1942 and 1943, the Allies experienced high casualty rates in the European theater, and airmen were faced with the terrifying prospect of flying mission after mission, knowing that each could be their last. Given these dire conditions, the Allied military realized that their pilots needed more than just rest and food. They needed a psychological boost to help them endure the mental strain of near-constant combat. To sustain the morale of their air crews, the Allies began to focus on the small comforts that could make a big difference. This included everything from letters from home to well-organized recreation programs. But one of the most striking methods employed was the delivery of ice cream. The delivery of ice cream to the airmen in combat zones was more than just a quirky detail. It was a part of a broader effort to humanize the experience of war. For the American airmen, these small moments of indulgence served to reinforce the idea that despite the horrors of battle, their well-being mattered. The practice began as a way to refresh pilots after long missions, a brief moment of sweetness in an otherwise brutal existence. But it quickly became a symbol of how the Allies cared for their air crews, providing them not just with sustenance, but with small luxuries that made them feel like they were valued. The logistics of delivering ice cream to airmen in combat zones were impressive in their own right. The ice cream had to be transported in refrigerated trucks, often over long distances, and had to be kept at the right temperature, despite the challenges posed by wartime infrastructure. At some airfields, ice cream would be served in the form of pre-packed cups or cones, handed out to pilots before they took off or after they returned from missions. The operation was efficient, but its impact was far-reaching. The ability to offer such a treat in the middle of the war helped foster a sense of camaraderie and morale among the pilots, who knew that their leaders were willing to go to great lengths to ensure their mental well-being. For the Germans, however, the disparity between their situation and that of the Allied pilots was jarring. The Luftwaffe, once considered one of the most formidable air forces in the world, was now struggling under the pressure of Allied bombing raids, constant attrition, and dwindling resources. While the Allies were able to provide small comforts like ice cream, the Germans had few such morale-boosting measures. Their pilots were often flying under the constant threat of being shot down, with little in the way of relief from the brutality of combat. The Luftwaffe's leadership, increasingly desperate as the war wore on, was focused primarily on sustaining the Air Force's fighting capabilities, and they often lacked the resources to focus on the well-being of individual pilots. The contrast between the two forces became even more pronounced in 1943 and 1944, as the U.S. 8th Air Force began conducting large-scale bombing raids over Germany. These long and perilous missions pushed the limits of the airmen's endurance. But amidst the chaos of battle, the Allies' commitment to maintaining their pilots' morale through small comforts, like ice cream, set them apart from the German experience. The Germans, by contrast, were increasingly unable to provide their pilots with such support. The long flights, the loss of comrades, and the constant threat of death weighed heavily on the men of the Luftwaffe. It wasn't just the physical toll of combat that wore them down, but the emotional and psychological strain that came with fighting in a war that was becoming ever more unwinnable. The simple act of offering ice cream to American pilots highlighted a cultural and psychological divide. To the German pilots, it was almost unbelievable that their enemies could be so relaxed in the face of such deadly combat. How could they afford such luxuries when the situation was so dire? And yet, for the Allies, these seemingly trivial acts of comfort were part of a broader strategy to keep their pilots in the fight, to remind them that they were more than just soldiers, more than just cogs in the military machine. They were individuals who deserved to be cared for, even in the midst of war. For many of the German pilots who encountered or learned about this practice, it became a symbol of the stark difference in wartime experiences. While they endured harsh conditions, the Allies had found ways to make the brutal realities of aerial combat more bearable. And though the war would ultimately end in defeat for Germany, this cultural contrast would be remembered by those who survived, a strange and unexpected marker of the Allied approach to warfare. For the Allied pilots, the delivery of ice cream in the midst of war became a symbol of the respect and care afforded to them by their leaders. The ice cream was more than a fleeting indulgence. It was a reminder that despite the horrors of the battlefield, their humanity was recognized. In an environment where life expectancy was often measured in weeks or months and every flight could be their last, the smallest of comforts could make a significant difference. The psychological toll of aerial combat was immense. Pilots had to contend with the constant fear of death, the stress of being in the air for extended hours, and the mental strain of seeing fellow comrades fall. For the Americans, the act of providing something as simple as ice cream was an attempt to balance the brutality of their missions. It wasn't a luxury in the traditional sense. It was an essential tool for keeping men alive not just physically, but mentally. These small acts of kindness, whether ice cream, letters from home, or a well-timed moment of rest, helped pilots retain their sense of purpose and camaraderie. In many ways, the practice of offering ice cream was a form of emotional inoculation. It was a reminder that the war was not only about destruction and death, but also about maintaining morale and hope. The pilots, who often faced the brutality of war alone in the skies, were given a moment to share in something lighthearted and familiar. It was a fleeting escape from the harshness of combat, but for many, it was enough to renew their resolve. For the German pilots, the idea that Allied forces could afford such comfort seemed both baffling and unsettling. The Luftwaffe, fighting a war on multiple fronts, was constantly on the defensive. The situation for German pilots had grown increasingly dire, with fewer supplies, mounting casualties, and no respite from the endless aerial battles. The lack of a similar morale-boosting effort for their own forces made the contrast even starker. The Luftwaffe's leadership, under pressure from Hitler and his generals to keep fighting, was focused solely on maintaining combat readiness. There was little time or energy for small luxuries, and even fewer resources for psychological well-being. For German pilots, many of whom had flown countless missions with little relief, the idea of ice cream in the middle of battle seemed almost incomprehensible. How could the Allies afford such indulgences when the war was nearing its peak, with defeat looming on the horizon? It was a reminder of the differences in how the two sides viewed the value of their pilots. While the Allies made efforts to keep their airmen healthy and strong, the Germans saw their pilots primarily as instruments of war, disposable, and often left to fight on despite the growing personal cost. The human cost of these differences went far beyond ice cream. While the Allies were able to maintain their pilots' morale, ensuring they were physically and mentally prepared for the battles ahead, the German pilots were worn down. Many had been flying for years, enduring the unrelenting pressure of the war with little in the way of comfort or support. The exhaustion from long flights, the constant threat of being shot down, and the psychological strain of watching comrades die in the skies left deep scars. The lack of simple comforts, whether food, rest, or even the occasional luxury, exacerbated the strain on the Luftwaffe's airmen. The contrast in experiences became even more pronounced as the war drew to a close. Allied air forces, particularly the Americans, were receiving constant reinforcements, and morale remained relatively high thanks to the care taken to look after their pilots. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots at an alarming rate. By 1944-45, German training programs were under strain, and the influx of fresh recruits was minimal. With fewer experienced pilots and the psychological toll of relentless combat weighing heavily, the Luftwaffe's ability to continue the fight was rapidly diminishing. In contrast, The Allies had not only the physical resources to continue their air campaigns, but also the psychological edge that helped sustain their forces even as the war entered its final, devastating phase. The psychological divide between the two sides became clear not only in the treatment of airmen, but also in their willingness to fight. For the Germans, there was a creeping realization that their cause was lost. The lack of morale-boosting efforts like the ice cream deliveries only deepened the sense of hopelessness that was beginning to set in among the pilots. For the Allies, the small luxuries and the attention to pilot welfare were part of a broader strategy of resilience, reminding their airmen that despite the overwhelming challenges of war, they were still valued. The logistical operation of delivering ice cream to Allied pilots in the midst of combat was a remarkable feat, considering the constraints of wartime resources. Ice cream, of course, was not an easy commodity to transport, especially during the heat of battle and when military infrastructure was already stretched thin. It required coordination, creativity, and a firm commitment to the idea that maintaining pilot morale was as important as the missions themselves. Ice cream was transported via refrigerated trucks that had to make their way to air bases, where pilots would be stationed or returning from missions. It was often a carefully timed operation, especially for the Americans whose airfields in Britain were positioned at the forefront of their assault on Nazi-occupied Europe. The trucks were sometimes disguised as standard supply vehicles to avoid drawing attention and to minimize the risk of enemy sabotage. In some instances, the ice cream was brought directly to the tarmacs just before pilots embarked on their missions, allowing them to enjoy a brief but much-needed respite before heading back into the sky. The logistics were not just about convenience. They were about showing the pilots that their needs, both physical and emotional, were important. Ice cream was not a priority for the war effort in the traditional sense, but the gesture was emblematic of how the Allies thought about their soldiers' well-being. It was an investment in the human side of warfare, something that was often overlooked in favor of firepower and strategy. For the Germans, the logistical constraints were far more severe. The Luftwaffe's resources had been drained by years of combat, and the need for basic supplies was prioritized over such morale-boosting luxuries. German pilots rarely had the luxury of enjoying something as simple as ice cream before or after a flight. Instead, they dealt with dwindling rations, scarce fuel, and long hours spent in the cockpit, often with little relief from the intensity of the war. The constant state of emergency in which they lived only deepened the disparity between the two forces. Where the Allies could afford small comforts, the Germans were left to endure the hardships of war without respite. The tactical importance of ice cream delivery, then, was not just about the physical nourishment it provided. It was about creating an atmosphere of care and concern for the men who would go on to face some of the most intense aerial battles of the war. It was a strategic decision that, while seemingly trivial, had profound effects on morale and, by extension, on the effectiveness of Allied air operations. The decision to serve ice cream to pilots in the midst of battle was not merely a whimsical idea. It was the result of careful thought from military leadership, particularly in the American 8th Air Force. The leadership recognized that the nature of the air war was psychologically and physically demanding, often pushing pilots to their limits. Pilots were not only exposed to extreme danger from enemy fighters and flak, but also endured immense mental stress from long, exhausting missions over hostile territory. Acknowledging this, Allied commanders implemented morale-boosting strategies designed to reduce the strain on their airmen and keep them combat effective for longer periods. This was not a luxury for the pilots. It was a psychological tool. Airmen faced some of the highest casualty rates in the war, particularly in the early years of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. By 1943, when the air raids intensified, the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers began to experience the crushing pressure of sustained missions, many of which lasted 8 hours or longer. For every successful mission, the bomber crews suffered significant losses. The stress of knowing that the odds were stacked against them was a powerful motivator for Allied command to find innovative ways to relieve the burden on their pilots. The ice cream deliveries, though seemingly trivial, were part of a larger strategy by Allied leaders to provide not just the necessary equipment for battle, but to take care of the psychological well-being of their troops. It was a recognition that morale was just as important as firepower. General Henry H. Arnold, The commanding general of the USAAF and other military leaders understood that keeping airmen in peak mental condition would help them perform under pressure. This simple yet effective strategy helped foster a sense of camaraderie and a bond between the men and their commanders, reinforcing the idea that the airmen were not just disposable assets but individuals whose well-being mattered. The German High Command, in contrast, had a very different approach to its pilots. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe found itself in a constant state of desperation, with its leadership focused on maintaining a semblance of military strength despite dwindling resources. Many of the Luftwaffe pilots were older and more experienced, but as the war progressed, they found themselves fighting a losing battle. There was little focus on their well-being beyond keeping them in the air. While there were some efforts to boost morale, such as providing alcohol to pilots before missions, the German leadership, like the rest of the Nazi regime, often viewed their pilots as expendable, part of the machine that was grinding toward its inevitable collapse. This contrast in leadership priorities highlights the differing approaches taken by the two sides. The Allies, recognizing the need to sustain their men's will to fight, took every possible measure to ensure their pilots could endure the war's physical and mental toll. The Germans, however, viewed their pilots more as tools of war, and though they admired their courage, there was little effort made to provide comfort during the brutal conditions of aerial combat. This lack of care for their pilots eventually took its toll. As the Allies' air campaign intensified, many of the German pilots who survived the early years of the war found themselves either dead or mentally and physically exhausted by 1944 and 1945. The lack of a morale-based strategy, the absence of comfort measures like ice cream, and the relentless pace of combat contributed to a decline in their combat effectiveness. On the other hand, the Allied pilots, empowered not just with superior technology and resources but also with a sense of being valued and supported, were able to maintain their effectiveness in combat. The simple gesture of providing ice cream, while seemingly small, spoke volumes about how the Allies understood the importance of treating their airmen as human beings. This practice helped cement the cultural difference between the two forces. One focused on exploiting its airmen to the fullest extent possible, while the other focused on preserving their fighting spirit through compassion, camaraderie, and small comforts. For the German pilots, news of the Allies' ice cream deliveries was, understandably, a source of bewilderment and, in some cases, resentment. The Luftwaffe, struggling to maintain an effective fighting force by 1944, had little in the way of such luxuries. While the German leadership focused on maintaining their technological edge and replenishing their squadrons with younger, less experienced pilots, they were unable to match the Allies in terms of psychological care for their troops. It was hard for the German pilots to understand how the Allies, who had become their deadliest adversaries, could afford such comforts when they themselves were enduring such hardships. For many in the Luftwaffe, the concept of ice cream delivered to pilots at airfields, especially in combat zones, seemed absurd. Wasn't it a waste of resources? An indulgence in the face of overwhelming war? The reality, however, was that for the Allies, this was a calculated effort to preserve their airmen's mental health, to provide them with brief moments of peace and joy amid the constant fear and stress of combat. The disparity between the two air forces became even more apparent as the war dragged on. The German pilots, particularly those in the later stages of the conflict, were flying older, less reliable aircraft. They were often outnumbered and outgunned by the superior Allied forces. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, was slowly being dismantled, while the Allies, buoyed by increasing numbers, resources, and morale, had a clear advantage in the skies. This psychological toll was not limited to the pilots alone. The German command was increasingly demoralized as well, witnessing firsthand the decline of the Luftwaffe. As Allied bombers continued their relentless raids over German cities and industrial centers, the German military was forced into a defensive posture, unable to mount the same kind of sustained offense that had characterized the early years of the war. The lack of support for the pilots only exacerbated the feeling of helplessness that permeated the Luftwaffe. The ice cream deliveries, when learned of by the Germans, were a stark reminder of the divide in resources, care, and ideology between the two sides. The Allied forces, despite the hardships of war, had created an environment that attempted to preserve the humanity of their pilots. For the Germans, this only underscored the growing gulf between their own disillusionment and the hope, however fragile, that still existed in the Allied camps. By 1944, the Allies were firmly entrenched in the skies over Europe, launching large-scale bombing raids that hammered German industrial centers, transportation hubs, and military infrastructure. The 8th Air Force, tasked with the difficult mission of strategic daylight bombing, had seen its forces grow stronger as more pilots, bombers, and aircraft were funneled into the fight. The losses, however, remained staggering, and airmen faced death every time they climbed into their planes. Yet as grim as the situation was, Allied leadership had begun to focus on the psychological aspect of the war, recognizing that the mental and emotional toll on their pilots was as dangerous as the physical one. It was during this period, in the midst of the intensity and destruction of the war, that ice cream deliveries to airfields became a regular part of airmen's lives. These small comforts began to symbolize not just the practical steps the Allies took to keep their airmen motivated, but also the stark contrast between the two sides' war efforts. The delivery of ice cream was no longer a surprise or a novelty. It had become an ingrained part of the culture, a mark of the Allies' investment in maintaining their pilots' spirits. For the German pilots, by contrast, morale continued to erode. They were facing mounting losses on all fronts, and the reality of an increasingly unwinnable war weighed heavily on their minds. As the Luftwaffe continued to suffer from insufficient reinforcements, dwindling fuel supplies, and a growing gap in technology between them and the Allies, the news of Allied airmen enjoying ice cream, amidst the very same battles they were fighting, was a striking moment of realization. How in the midst of war's cruelty could the Allies afford such luxuries for their pilots? How could the Germans, exhausted and increasingly demoralized, continue to hold their ground against an enemy that not only outnumbered them, but offered its men small, life-affirming pleasures to keep them fighting? It was during one of these moments of realization, perhaps after a particularly intense raid, that a senior Luftwaffe officer found himself in conversation with an Allied POW. The German officer, worn from months of heavy fighting, asked about the experiences of the American airmen who had been captured during raids. The POW, perhaps bitter from his own suffering, spoke casually about the ice cream deliveries, how airmen would line up for a quick treat before heading back into the skies, ready to risk everything again. The German officer's disbelief was palpable. How could such a thing exist in the midst of this brutal, unforgiving conflict? For the German leadership, this was a turning point, not just in terms of the realization that they were fighting a different kind of war, but in the growing understanding that their morale efforts had failed. The Allies had succeeded in maintaining the spirits of their airmen, even while the war raged on, while the German pilots were left with little more than the grim reality of their situation. The question wasn't just how long the Luftwaffe could keep fighting, it was whether they could even keep their airmen in the fight at all. As the war wore on, and the Allies continued their relentless bombing campaigns, the disparity in resources and psychological support became ever more apparent. The German pilots, who had once been part of the most feared air force in the world, were now engaged in a losing battle, flying outdated aircraft, enduring endless missions, and struggling with a war that seemed doomed from the outset. The ice cream that served as a symbol of Allied morale efforts became a powerful reminder of the psychological cost of war, of how small gestures of care and humanity could shift the balance between survival and surrender, hope and despair. The turning point had arrived not with a single moment of violence or a dramatic shift in military tactics, but in the realization that the war was, in part, being fought not only on the ground and in the sky, but in the hearts and minds of the men who flew those planes. The ice cream, trivial as it seemed, represented an effort by the Allies to win the war on this hidden battlefield, the battle for morale, for the emotional resilience of their airmen. And as the Luftwaffe continued to face defeat on every front, it was clear that the Allied commitment to pilot welfare had become as crucial to their success as any military strategy. The real turning point came in the fall of 1944, as the Allied bombing campaigns reached their peak intensity. The 8th Air Force, now conducting hundreds of bombing raids over Germany and occupied Europe every week, had become a formidable force. The air war had evolved from strategic strikes on military and industrial targets to all-out campaigns designed to cripple the heart of Nazi Germany. With each passing day, the pressure mounted on German defenses, on their airmen, on their commanders, and on their ability to sustain the fight. But while the intensity of the bombing campaign soared, the Luftwaffe's ability to respond was faltering. The once dominant force had been decimated by years of constant air combat, massive losses in both men and aircraft, and the relentless pressure from Allied air superiority. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of mounting a coordinated and effective defense against the Allied bombers, and their fighter pilots were increasingly outnumbered. The moral and physical exhaustion that plagued the German pilots became impossible to ignore. The stark contrast between the Allied air forces and the Luftwaffe became even clearer as the air raids escalated. While the Allies continued to reinforce their airmen, providing them with better equipment, more advanced tactics, and even the small comforts like ice cream to boost morale, the Germans were facing a steady erosion of their forces. The High Command, struggling to find new recruits and running out of experienced pilots, was forced to rely on younger, less trained airmen who had little combat experience. The Luftwaffe's leadership knew they were in a losing battle, and that reality created a sense of futility in the ranks. In a dramatic moment, a German fighter squadron, after being decimated during a dogfight with Allied bombers, was sent back to their base, their morale shattered. As they landed, exhausted and broken, they overheard a conversation from the Allied POWs held nearby. The American pilots were casually discussing their most recent ice cream delivery, almost in jest, as if it were an everyday part of life. For the German pilots, this moment crystallized the disparity between their reality and that of the Allies. While they fought tooth and nail for every inch of the sky, the Americans were able to joke about something as trivial as ice cream. Amidst the destruction of war, it wasn't just the ice cream. It was the entire psychological and emotional divide that the ice cream represented. The Allied airmen had been given the means to endure, to keep going despite the crushing toll of combat. They were not only soldiers, they were individuals with morale-boosting luxuries who could feel a fleeting sense of normalcy even as they prepared to face death in the skies. The Germans, on the other hand, were increasingly being treated as expendable. Their leaders saw them as tools to be used until they were broken, rather than men to be nurtured and preserved. This moment, a subtle but powerful one, captured the essence of the turning point for the Luftwaffe. The Germans knew that their chances of winning the war were slipping away, and for the pilots, the realization that the Allies had the luxury of ice cream, of simple comforts in the midst of war, underscored the growing gap in resources, leadership, and morale between the two sides. It was an instance of psychological warfare that did not involve weapons, but rather the contrast in how each side treated its men. The Allied forces were fighting with not only overwhelming numbers and technological superiority, but with the knowledge that their men were valued, not just as soldiers, but as individuals. The Germans were fighting a desperate and losing battle, without the same kind of psychological reinforcement, and their ability to sustain morale was rapidly crumbling. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Allies would prove unstoppable. The Luftwaffe's attempts to defend Germany from the relentless Allied bombings were futile, and the morale of the German pilots continued to plummet. The ice cream deliveries, though small in nature, were a symbolic gesture that stood in stark contrast to the German experience. It was in these moments of realization, these quiet, almost trivial moments, that the true cost of war revealed itself, not just in the loss of lives, but in the destruction of the human spirit. The turning point wasn't simply the final collapse of the Luftwaffe, it was the moment when the men in the sky realized that they were not just fighting for their lives but for their sense of self. The Allied pilots, who had small comforts to help them endure, were winning a war on a psychological front that their enemies could not match. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had been utterly broken. Years of intense aerial combat, staggering losses, and a relentless series of bombing raids had decimated the once proud Air Force. The few remaining German pilots, many of whom had spent years fighting on the front lines, were exhausted and disillusioned. The Allied bombing campaign, coupled with the D-Day invasion and the subsequent advance of Allied ground forces, left little room for the Luftwaffe to operate. While the German military continued to resist on the ground, the skies above Europe were largely controlled by the Allies. The psychological toll on the German pilots was profound. By now, many had come to accept the inevitable defeat, yet they still flew, often out of a sense of duty, honor, or the sheer exhaustion of having no other choice. The ice cream served to the Allied pilots throughout the war, a symbol of the stark contrast in morale between the two sides, was now a distant memory for the Luftwaffe. The Germans, who had once enjoyed the pride of air superiority, found themselves scrambling to defend a shattered nation, with their airmen being sent into battle with fewer resources and less support. The war for the Luftwaffe was no longer about victory but survival. For the Allies, the end of the war did not come with an immediate sense of triumph, but with the quiet realization of the human cost of the conflict. While the war was far from over in the Pacific, the European theater had been all but won by the spring of 1945. But victory had come at an immense cost to the airmen, many of whom had lost friends and comrades in the skies above Europe. The ice cream deliveries, though a small comfort, had been a lifeline for many, keeping their spirits high in the face of constant death and destruction. For the surviving pilots, the contrast between their early days in the war, when ice cream was a novelty, and the grim final months, when the full scope of the war's cost became evident, was sharp. The ice cream, and the other small comforts afforded to the Allied pilots, symbolized the difference in the psychological care given to airmen on both sides. While the Germans were left to endure the brutality of war with minimal support, the Allies, despite their own suffering, sought to ensure their men's well-being. The fact that ice cream, a simple luxury, was delivered to pilots in the middle of such a destructive war became a poignant reminder of the gap in resources, leadership, and morale between the two forces. After the war, many surviving Allied pilots would look back at the seemingly trivial moments, like the delivery of ice cream during a particularly grueling mission, and recognize how these small comforts had helped them endure. They were more than just soldiers. They were men who had been cared for by their leadership, treated not just as instruments of war, but as human beings whose psychological well-being was as crucial to victory as the equipment they flew. The Germans, in contrast, had never been afforded such luxuries. While many of their pilots had been capable, determined, and brave, they had fought in a war without the same focus on their mental and emotional health. And as the war came to a close, the German pilots found themselves abandoned, their morale shattered, and their nation broken. The aftermath of the war left Germany in ruins, both physically and psychologically. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was decimated. Thousands of its pilots were dead or imprisoned, and those who survived were left to cope with the trauma of their experiences. The contrast between their fate and the fate of Allied pilots, their treatment, their morale, and their ability to endure, remained one of the most glaring differences in how the two sides had fought the war. The war's conclusion saw Germany left in ruins, not only physically, but psychologically. For the surviving Luftwaffe pilots, the aftermath was filled with uncertainty, despair, and trauma. The loss of the air war was just one part of their broader defeat. After the collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945, many pilots found themselves among the millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, or in the grips of a nation facing occupation and punishment. The Allied forces, particularly the US and the UK, focused on the massive task of denazification, rebuilding Germany, and establishing peace in Europe. The Luftwaffe pilots, now reduced to prisoners or survivors, were left to deal with the fallout of their role in the war. Many were captured and imprisoned by the Allies, their morale shattered not just by the defeat, but by the years of relentless fighting they had endured. For the Germans, the loss was more than strategic, it was personal. The psychological scars of the war ran deep, particularly for those who had been part of the Luftwaffe. Their once proud force had been obliterated, and they found themselves trapped in a conflict that had ultimately consumed their identity. In stark contrast, the surviving Allied pilots were treated differently. They were regarded not only as victors but also as survivors of an incredibly harrowing conflict. For many, their treatment after the war was in some ways a recognition of their sacrifices. The care for Allied pilots, which had included comforts like ice cream and other morale-boosting measures, became part of the broader narrative of Allied superiority. an indication of how the Allies viewed their men, as not just tools of war, but as individuals whose mental well-being and survival were important. This treatment, though not perfect, stood in sharp contrast to the approach taken by the German military, which often viewed its airmen as expendable. After the war, the stories of the Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had been young men thrust into a brutal war they didn't start, became a part of the complex legacy of Nazi Germany's defeat. Many of these pilots would later express feelings of betrayal and abandonment, as they reflected on how they had been sent into battle without the kind of support their counterparts in the Allies had received. It wasn't just the lack of ice cream, it was the absence of a support system, the lack of respite from the war's horrors, and the overwhelming sense of duty without recognition of their humanity. The stark difference in treatment between the German and Allied pilots echoed throughout the post-war years. Allied pilots, many of whom had survived thanks to a combination of luck and the care they received from their commanders, found themselves reintegrating into civilian life with a sense of camaraderie and relief. The psychological trauma of war remained, of course, but for the Allies, there was recognition of their struggle and a process of healing that took place, however slowly. For the Germans, however, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long and painful process of coming to terms with their involvement. Many pilots who had fought in the Luftwaffe found themselves navigating a complex post-war identity, struggling not only with the trauma of war, but with the moral and emotional weight of their actions. The Luftwaffe pilots were left to reckon with the bitter truth that their contributions had been in service of a losing cause, one that had led to the devastation of their homeland and the collapse of the ideals they had once fought for. The Allied ice cream deliveries, which had served as small but significant morale boosters during the war, became a symbol of a broader wartime difference, one that wasn't just about tactics or technology, but about the care and respect given to soldiers on both sides. While the Allies had made their pilots' well-being a priority, ensuring they had a mental and emotional reprieve in the midst of the war, the Germans had relied on an almost brutal efficiency, treating their pilots as instruments of war until they were no longer needed. As the years passed and the world moved away from the war, the psychological wounds of both the Allied and German airmen remained. The trauma of battle, the loss of comrades, and the heavy psychological burden of surviving a brutal conflict could not be erased by time. But for the Allies, the small gestures like the ice cream deliveries were a part of the broader healing process, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could find a way to offer comfort. For the Germans, however, there was no such balm. Their defeat was absolute, and they were left to rebuild not only their country but their shattered psyches. As the Cold War began to take shape, the difference in the wartime experiences of the Allies and the Germans was crystallized. The psychological, emotional, and moral impacts of the war would continue to affect both sides for years to come. The ice cream, a seemingly insignificant detail in the broader sweep of history, became emblematic of how the care for soldiers, whether on the battlefield or off it, could shape the outcome of a war and the legacy that followed. The story of ice cream delivered to Allied pilots in the midst of battle, so seemingly trivial on the surface, serves as a poignant reflection of the complex nature of warfare and the human experience within it. War is often seen as a clash of armies, of strategies, and of technologies, but it is also, and perhaps more profoundly, a battle of spirits. The contrasting experiences of Allied and German pilots, exemplified by the simple act of offering ice cream, highlights not just the physical realities of combat, but the psychological and emotional dimensions that shape how individuals survive war. For the Allied forces, especially the Americans and the British, providing small comforts like ice cream represented a deliberate and thoughtful strategy. It was an investment not just in the material resources of war, but in the resilience and well-being of their airmen. In a war marked by unimaginable loss and destruction, where lives were often measured in hours or days, these acts of humanity, small moments of indulgence, allowed pilots to endure the horrors of battle, to feel seen and cared for, even as they prepared to risk everything. This was more than a gesture. It was a recognition that the men flying these dangerous missions were not just soldiers. They were human beings who needed moments of respite to maintain their spirit and strength. For the German pilots, however, the war was a cruel and relentless affair. From the first days of conflict to the final, devastating collapse of the Luftwaffe, they faced a reality where little in the way of morale-boosting support was offered. They were not treated as human beings in the same way their Allied counterparts were. The Luftwaffe's leadership, preoccupied with maintaining a fighting force, failed to provide their men with the psychological care needed to sustain them in the face of overwhelming odds. The German experience was marked by sacrifice but also by a profound sense of abandonment, where morale was disregarded and the pilots were left to endure without the comfort of small, humanizing gestures. In the face of such disregard, many German pilots fought on, but at great personal cost. The difference in how the two sides treated their airmen shaped not just the course of individual lives, but the broader outcome of the war. While both sides fought valiantly, it was the Allies' holistic approach, recognizing the mental and emotional toll of combat, that helped preserve the resilience of their pilots. It is easy to forget that in war it is not just the body that must be fed and kept strong, but the mind and spirit as well. The small comforts, the ice cream, the letters from home, the camaraderie, allowed Allied pilots to retain their determination and fighting spirit even in the face of staggering losses. For the German pilots, the war ended not only in physical defeat but in psychological devastation. They were left to reconcile with the fact that their efforts had been in service of a regime whose ideals had crumbled, and they would carry the scars of both the war and the personal sacrifices they had made for years to come. Their lack of support, morale-boosting measures, and recognition left them broken, with little to rebuild their spirits after the war's end. The ice cream deliveries, in their small but profound way, symbolized the divide between the Allies and the Axis, an emotional and psychological gap as wide as the one that existed in terms of military resources and strategies. The human side of war, often forgotten in favor of tactics and battles, was as decisive as any weapon or aircraft. In the end, it was not just the size of the bombers, the skill of the pilots, or the technology that won the war. It was the capacity to endure, to fight for a cause even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The Allies' investment in their pilots' well-being, demonstrated by something as simple as ice cream, proved to be a powerful tool for resilience. As we reflect on this war, and the small gestures that helped sustain it, we are reminded that war, in all its devastation, is fought on many fronts. Some are physical, where bombers roar through the skies and soldiers clash on the ground. But others are mental, emotional, and psychological, where soldiers' wills are tested and their humanity is preserved or stripped away. The simple act of offering ice cream during a brutal war is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can still find a way to care for those who are called to fight. This is the legacy of that small but powerful moment. It's a story not of victory or defeat, but of how the human spirit can be sustained amidst the chaos, even through the smallest acts of kindness. And perhaps in the face of such immense destruction, it is these small gestures that truly define the difference between survival and surrender.